Hello and welcome to this episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. This is one of our Eerie Extras, which is sort of where we do all the things that we can't fit elsewhere. And one of my favorite things to do is interviews. So I'm Katie Troyer, and I am so excited that I get to be joined by horror writer Mark N. Drake. Hey, Mark, thank you for joining us.
There. Hello, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes. Did you like how I said us as though it was the royal us? I was like, thank you for joining us instead of me.
I felt involved immediately in a massive network.
Good. That's exactly what I want, which I think makes sense considering that the sort of stuff you write, right? If there's not a shadowy underground, what's the point?
Exactly.
So I always like to start with a question that's somewhere between weird and just like an icebreaker before we get into the like what keeps you up at night and terrifies you, which we will get to. But first, a question that I'm glad I don't have to answer. If you were an animal, what animal would you be and why?
Oh yeah, I hate this sort of question because it really makes me think.
I know.
I've heard it before. I used to say shark just because I hate dentists.
Sure.
And sharks don't have any sensation in their teeth. But on reflection, well, I was going to say polar bear because I've been watching the BBC adaptation of his Dark Materials, and the polar bear is so cool.
Yeah.
But then I realised I was checking on this, and male polar bears don't hibernate; they stay awake all through the winter.
Really?
So I thought, I think they're missing out there. So I thought I'll just go for a standard, non-polar bear and sleep for 6 months through the winter.
I feel like you've chosen, both of them are such majestic animals. I'm like a raccoon or a wombat or some sort of, animal that often gets labeled as like a trash animal. I'm like, I like to emerge out at night, scavenge other people's food, go back into my dark hole. So I like that you've chosen majestic animals. I feel like that tells me what I need to know.
It's also animals I know nothing about because I've never seen a bear or shark in the wild and don't particularly want to see a shark in the wild. But, from a distance, they look pretty good.
Yes. I just watched, I don't know if it's out in the UK yet, but Cocaine Bear.
I've not heard of that, no.
So the title of the film is more or less the film, right? It's based on a true story of a situation here in the United States where a whole bunch of cocaine dropped, a bear ingested it. And then the film is like, this is kind of funny, but also really sad. So it's a very odd film. But it made me realize that I don't need to meet a bear in the wild. So. Okay. Other than a dentist, because that's why you chose shark, what scares you in real life? Because a lot of the fiction that you write has these, and it's one of my favorite parts, these sort of like supernatural, fantastical elements. But there are also things that I think I can see being like, I bet those are things Mark is like scared of in the real world. So what scares you in real life, and how do these fears play into your writing?
I don't think it's really come into anything I've written yet, but heights. I'm really not fond of heights. And I've tried to cure it. I've tried to cure myself. I've done charity abseiling and charity parachute jumps, and it just made it worse. So not fond of heights, as in, painting the ceiling is a challenge for me.
That's wild that you then did parachuting. I mean, went that. Yeah.
I thought kill or cure. Didn't help.
That's wild.
I guess I'm really not fond of creatures generally. Snakes, really don't like snakes.
Yeah.
If you read the second book, that might come out in the second book. Yeah. Spiders, not fond of spiders. Yeah. So I think there's an optimum range of legs that I'm happy with, and like 0 is too low, and 8 is too high, and I'm really not entirely sure about 6, to be honest. But but yeah,
I completely agree. I found that like the moment you put a couple legs on, I'm like, that's a cute lizard. But if it doesn't have legs, it's just not. It's not okay.
Exactly.
And growing up, I grew up in Arizona, which is one of our desert states. And we had scorpions.
That sounds snaky as well.
Yeah, it was snaky, and it was scorpions. And scorpions are also arachnids, but then they're the worst. So I would kill it, and then I would like leave a note that would say, underneath this paper is a scorpion. Please throw it away, because it just creeped me out. Like 8 legs, you're right. It was too many. Do you think? So you said that snakes comes into play in one of your books. Do you think you're going to explore more with heights? Like I could see that factoring into one of the mysteries and cases.
I think it's bound to. It's just not. It's not particularly happened yet, but I think it's bound to. It's bound to at some stage, and I'll be able to write with some certainty as to the dread of being up high.
So you have such tangible like real life fears, are there any of the fears that are more of the supernatural, not necessarily like I'm scared of ghosts, but like how do some of the supernatural fears translate for you into things that kind of keep you up at night in your Darkisle series?
They tend to not, to be honest.
Okay.
I have to be really bored. I mean, I was originally a physicist, so maybe that's it. Maybe that's it. Maybe my rationality has just driven it out. Also, I think if you were someone of a certain age, if you grew up in a sort of later stage of the Cold War, you've got certain fatalism, I think, about the fate of the world. And you see that in the new generations are much more running around trying to do something about things. I think our generation is a case of, we've got 3 minutes. What are we going to do in 3 minutes? Yes. So I think I like to invoke sorts of feelings of dread of something out there that's bigger than us. But I don't particularly feel it myself, to be honest.
That makes sense. And that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to ask a question that I'm realizing I may not be equipped to know the answer to, but like, what type of physicist were you? What did you study?
Yeah, I was a very most basic type of physicist. I was an applied physicist. And so it was all about knowing enough physics to do experimentation.
That's so
and
neat.
I did that. And I actually, my first job actually was in the field, and I enjoyed it greatly for a few years. I'm glad I did it. But it was time to move on after that. But
I like the fact, because, it seems like it's easy for a lot of people to think how they're going to apply chemistry or biology, because a lot of times they go into medicine. But I love the idea that, you can actually do things with physics. Like, we need to remind people that there are these other STEM fields, right, that are really exciting. And physics always just seems so appealing.
Yeah, it was, and it wasn't particle physics or astrophysics. I think particularly highfalutin. It was looking at, a lot of it was defense research and looking at basic things like, how does concrete break, and how do you break concrete better than you break it at the moment?
Oh, that's so neat, actually.
But I got to see the world. I got to travel to San Antonio for a conference, and to California and to Quebec and places like that. And so it was a good career. I'm glad I put my degree to some use. I've not done that for some years now, but I did start off with.
Did you ever think about creating a horror character, like a main character that was a physicist? Like, was that ever, because you have I can't remember, Jake is his name, is that completely
Jack?
Jack, sorry.
Yes.
I knew it was a male name that began with a J. Did you ever think about making him have a really robust background in physics or something like that?
Yeah, no, I didn't, to be honest. I always saw him as being a bit of a failed historian, and having a sort of, I think that gives him a way in to the sort of mythos I've created, as he's sort of flirted on the edges of that in the past. And I think physics, I mean, there are ways into horror with physics,
sure,
but none have occurred to me just yet.
But
who knows? Who knows?
You still have many books, I hope, that you're going to be writing in the next few years for me to read. So
I really hope so.
This is a good segue. So those of you listening, you should know I 100% threw several curveball questions in there. So thank you, Mark, for answering them all so well. But this is one of the questions that I told you I would ask ahead of time, because I love the Darkisle. I adore it when authors just create a place, right? And they just embed it with everything that's possible. And of course, Lovecraft did it. Stephen King did it. Mark and Drake did it. And in your description of Darkisle, right, it's the quote, British island of dark secrets and whispered terrors, which is fantastic. So I had like a couple parts to this question. You can take whatever you want. What is your favorite aspect of being able to return time and again to this particular place? And maybe after you've answered that, what is one aspect of Darkisle that you have not yet had a chance to explore, but that is like coming up soon, you hope?
Sure. I think in terms of the aspects of returning to it, I am finding the place. I do think quite visually. I think, and I am finding the place easier and easier to visualize. And each time I write about it, I sort of put some flesh on the bones of, well, what does that lane look like? What do the trees next to it look like? And I know a bit more for next time. So I guess I feel more comfortable with it each time I revisit it. The second thing is, I think the two ways to make your life really easy as a writer is to write about right now, because you know everything about, I know the cost of a pint in the pub which I'm going to after this interview, because I live that life. Or write about a place that you completely invented, because the cost of a pint in the pub is what you damn well say it is.
Right.
Everything in between is much more hard work. So actually, the research I have to do to get Jack from Manchester to Liverpool, and the parts of his life, because I do like to be accurate. So I have to research train times. I have to research what the names of docks were called. And I have to research what the streets were like in the 1920s, etc. Because I feel I have to. Once I'm on Darkisle, that's my island. There's one hotel. There's one hotel in the middle of Darkisle, because I say there is. So it does mean the amount of research drops off when you worry more about the story and less about the research. I can't stop myself researching. When he's in England, I have to do it properly.
Yes, and you can tell, you can feel it in your fiction, that it feels grounded in a way that's meaningful, right? Because it doesn't feel like Darkisle is nowhere. It's in a version of our planet that just happens to be not this one, right? And I appreciate that, because it feels more authentic, which is weird to say about something that's going to go Lovecraftian, but it's the accurate description for your work. So that's great.
To me, it has to be found. Originally, I suppose, when I was first starting out writing short stories, I really was maybe thinking of setting a lot of them in my home county of Derbyshire, which is quite a hilly area. It's a little bit, it's remote by British standards, but by American standards, it's not nowhere's remote. But I just found it's just too small a county, I think, to do that, to credibly do that. And I think you can go two ways with that, which is either you focus on a very intimate level of horror in a little town, which is fine, or you create like a sort of a Neverwhere type parallel beneath it, both of which are great. Obviously, Neverwhere is a great example of how that works. But I thought, no, actually, I want some physical isolation. I don't want just some. I don't want just some parallel, hard to reach universe that you enter by going through the right sort of door or falling down the right sort of rabbit hole. I want something that's actually physically difficult to get to and physically difficult to communicate with. And I also find if you're writing mystery, certainly my version of mystery is having characters who can't just pick up a phone and Google. Does put them in, make for more, I think you can put them in more interesting situations. Now, obviously, the 1920s, they can't Google, but I've got that version on Darkisle. They can't even pick up a phone on Darkisle. No phone cable's been laid. So I do find that that ability to isolate characters, both physically and in terms of communication, really helps with my writing and the sort of plots I have in mind.
That's terrific. So then that leads to the second part, which is what is. And maybe it's a specific place on the island. Maybe it's like a specific aspect of the world that you've created. But what are you excited about going to sometime in the future?
Yeah. The heart of darkness at Darkisle is the northeast coast, which so I think so basically when Jack is first thinking about going to Darkisle, people in Liverpool saying you don't want to go to Darkleby, and you get to Darkleby and people in Darkleby saying you don't want to go to Murdoch. And I'm gradually you're going to work out, I think it's pretty obvious, I think, from the first couple of novels, that the further you get to that sort of northern part of the island that's not got a proper road going to it, that's not got any major towns in it, that's where things are going to start getting really wild.
Oh, that's exciting. Very neat. And what is it something about the being on the coast in particular that is intriguing to you about that, the sort of like extra horrorness there? Or is it just that like an island is going to have a whole bunch of ghosts?
Although I'm from Derbyshire, which is probably the one county in Derbyshire that's actually in England that's the furthest from the sea. I think you're never far from the sea in Britain. So I think so. Sea is always part of it. I think I've got a very specific event in mind to end the series, and that very specific event is going to happen where a coastal situation is appropriate, shall we say? So I think if that sent that way, that really sort of set me thinking in those terms. Also, there are certain Lovecraftian species which I think will be familiar to people who tend to hang out at the seaside. So and they're going to play a part in that too. So for those are the main reasons, really.
That's exciting. You know how the more like horror you consume, the more you never knew that you had like really weird sub niches of
Yes.
sub. So I've realized that aquatic horror is hands down one of my favorite types of horror,
Yes.
because
Yes.
the ocean is terrifying and we should all be afraid of it. So
I think just the sheer fact that you've got this huge expanse, but you actually anything that's like an inch below the surface, you can't see it. And I think that's a great source of horror.
Yes, it really is. So you mentioned, this is a off prompt question, and I know that like there are secrets you want to retain, but you have an end game in mind. So do you have a certain number of books you're hoping will be in the series, or you just know that you will be at the end when you get to a certain set of events?
Yeah, the books in this, the books is a movable feast. The third book kind of suggested itself during COVID, to be honest, and didn't need to be there, or all the events in that book that led towards the final scenario, the final act, could have been put into the book I'm writing now. But yeah, it covers. Obviously I can't say how long it covers, because otherwise you're going to know when it gets to this year that this is the final one. It covers a finite period of time. There's an end date, as a historical event that happened in our world that's going to be the end point of it. And I'm, the number of books it takes to get there is slightly movable feast, but yeah, I have an end point in mind.
Oh, that's great. And then is your goal or hope or thought to stay in this world, but maybe introduce another character, or do you have other worlds that you're wanting to go to?
I always feel like a complete fraud talking about it on a horror podcast. I always wanted to be a science fiction writer.
Okay.
And I've written sort of a number of attempts at writing science fiction. That I mean, some of them a couple of them are in my collection, short story collection that came out.
Oh, great!
Just Shards of Shattered Darkness. So whilst they're on the horrific side of horror, they are of science fiction. They are science fiction. But yeah, I've got a couple of science fiction novels that sort of ground to a halt at about the 30,000 word mark. So I might revisit those next. Take a break from the Darkisle universe for a while. But I do see myself returning to it.
I mean, it's a good place to return to. There's so much in there, and like you said, now that you can tell anyone what that lane looks like, right? Like just the amount of detail that you have, that sort of schematics, that's really neat. So I like to ask this question, and there's two ways to ask it, and at some point it's a question of just like, what are you engaging with? But the first question I always like to ask is, what are a couple of texts, and I use that term really loosely. I think it can be like books, short stories, it can be games, video or board, it can be movies, TV shows, anything. But what are some texts that you recommend for horror creators who are just wanting to better understand the genre that they're creating in?
Yes, that's one that you sent me, and that set me thinking quite a bit. Partly because it is, again, I've got that sort of imposter syndrome of being a horror writer,
right?
But also because I think the more you're writing it, in particular, and certainly the more you're reading it, of course, it is actually such a very wide genre.
Yes.
And there are elements of it that I've got much more in common with crime writing or science fiction than they have with other parts of horror, for instance. So having said that, I think I'm going to go with one that I always say, because it's probably the first time I remember I remember watching this. I was still quite young, in my early teens. So I was watching it alone. It was a late night film. And the living room, the TV is at one end of the house, and my bedroom's at the far end of the house. There's like a 10-yard corridor, hallway in between. And at that film, it's the longest 10 yards I've ever walked in my life. And that was the 1963 version of The Haunting. And also in terms of a written book, the Haunting of Hill House, the original. Just for a way of, I think my writing is very character driven. It's about having believable people who do believable things, not just jumping through hoops because there's a cool thing the plot could make them do. And I think that the writing of that book, and really the Eleanor character, the complexity of her, and the way the other characters around her too they're by no means just there to make up numbers. So I would say, both in terms of how to write a really unsettling ghost story, and then how to adapt it, and just the use of lighting and cinematography to make it effective, with no monsters, nothing really. it's just a masterpiece. And then you can watch the 1990s remake for how not to do it.
I know. So I teach a class on adaptations and remakes in horror. And this time around, we're reading Jackson's book, and then we're watching the Netflix series, actually, because I want my students to understand what would you do if you just went completely different. But sometime I desperately want to just do one where we work our way through the adaptations, because I keep making references. I'm like, picture in your mind the following cast from the 93 film. And they're like, what? And I'm like, yes, these are bad ideas. But it's interesting that you talk about the quietness of it, because that's what my students were talking about, right? They really didn't mention the supernatural. It was ostracization and being alone, even when you're in a crowd, and these things that I think you can see certainly in your text, because you're right. Even though Jackson's novel is more gothic than anything, it has that mood and that atmosphere that works for film noir, that works for just any crime narrative, right? Of someone coming in and saying, I'm going to solve this crime, but none of you are going to trust me for a second. And then I'm going to question myself at some point, like that makes total sense. And it's an amazing book. So yay.
Yeah. If I can also mention a further one,
please.
In terms of short story writing, short form fiction, I always think that Arthur Machen is hugely underrated. I'm
not even sure I know who that is.
Okay, so he was writing around about the 1890s and early 1900s.
Okay.
And in fact, I think Stephen King said that one of his shorts, the Great God Pan, is the greatest horror story, short horror story written.
That's great.
So King's a huge fan, and I'm quite a fan of his writing too. Although it's written a long time ago, it's very accessible writing. I've been reading The Turn the Screw, the Henry James story, written within a couple of years of when Machen was writing his better stuff, but far less accessible, I have to say. It's a great concept, but quite hard read for modern eyes, whereas Machen has got a very much more modern style of writing, and there's a certain some of the stories, particularly one called The Golden Pyramid, made a real impact on me. And I think one of the elements of the impact on it is partly you've got this fear of the other, you've got basically the little people. I think Machen was Welsh, so he was and quite mystically minded. So he was writing quite a lot about, a lot of stories have these malignant, I won't say elves in the sense of elves like, in Tolkien or anything like that, but these malignant people. So there's that, but also there's a kind of a chilly detachment to his writing. Things happen in one thing I learned about from his writing is it's often very scary to have something just happen in the margins. It's not written down on the page as to exactly what's happened, but there's just a comment which tells you that something happened off the page, which leaves it to your imagination, which is often worse, I think.
Yes.
And he's a master of that.
That sounds lovely. I tend to not read, when I'm reading for my sake, as much short fiction, but I also feel that horror is often easier to do in short form than it is in longer form, because the moment you start caring about characters, which you usually do in a long form, right? The moment that, I don't know, some of the horror of like, these are terrible people in a terrible situation is removed. Whereas in short fiction, you can be like, these are terrible people, and in films, you can say these are terrible people, but you only have to deal with them for 90 minutes. It's a harder sell to be like, but you're going to sit with them for the next 14 to 16 hours. So that's lovely. So I'm always looking for good fiction that reminds me, short form fiction, of why I think that's where the genre sort of sits at most comfortably. And you write both long form and short form.
Yes.
Just depending on the story, or?
Well, for years I could never. I always wanted, as long as always wanted to be a novelist. Been a physicist and a university administrator, but really, I always wanted to be a novelist, and I could never get past. I could never make a story stand up past a few thousand words without it looking ridiculously padded, and that's the point I usually gave up. And so I've got a lot of quite wordy 30,000 word failures lying around, which I might revisit one day. But I always enjoyed writing short stories, and I always felt I was quite good at it. And then I just set that it wasn't a COVID project. I sat down sort of late 2019 and thought, you know what, I've got a couple of stories here, which if I cobble them together and I've got a good point, I can link them. It'll make a novel. I'm just going to write it and see if I can get to the end. And I got to the end, and I felt, wow, I did it. so then I wrote another one.
That's a clever way to do it.
And the next one was actually just one story. It wasn't. I wasn't stealing from previous short stories and adding them together. It was an actual novel from its inception, and it's a different sort of stamina you need, a different sort of writing perspective on writing you need, very much so. And I think you're right. I think a lot of science fiction and horror really lends itself to short form writing. I think that's because you may be exploring concepts and you're exploring ideas more than exploring people.
Yes.
So I think it's a real challenge for me and here's me writing a series of novels, having said that. But yeah, I do actually see what you say, and I agree with what you say on that. I think my challenge as a novelist is to just try and find a way of keeping people engaged by making it about a slow build-up. It's going to be a slow build-up towards when the realization of what's finally happening and how finally it can be stopped. And that it will be a pretty horrific decision that we have to make at the end.
Yes. Excellent. And I will be asking you in just a little bit a question that's about genre, because I think a lot of what you're talking about is also this sort of intersections of where your particular writing falls. But before we get there, I like to ask this question because the framework helped me to understand the texts that terrify me versus the texts that maybe have excellent jump scares, right? And that is that there's a scholar whose name is Linda Holland Toll, and she said we can put horror into sort of two buckets. There's affirmative horror and disaffirmative horror. And affirmative horror at the end of the day says, you know what? Good news, the monster was outside. It was a stranger. It was not one of us. We have defeated it. We can go back to normal. And of course, a lot of like slasher films do that. A lot of films or books that are, with some sort of supernatural element that gets defeated and then the humans triumph does that. But then there's disaffirmative horror. And of course, I think almost everything Shirley Jackson is writing is disaffirmative because they're like, no, it's us. We're the problem. Our society is the problem. We're the monster. And I realized, once I was given this framework that like, it's disaffirmative horror that scares me, right? Affirmative horror has lots of jump scares, and I'm a huge fan of jump scares. But at the end of the day, I'm like, oh, good, and done. Whereas, disaffirmative leaves me thinking about garbage people and like, a garbage society and all that stuff. So where would you classify your writing, particularly your Darkisle series?
Yeah. I'd say it's quite a useful structure to use, I think, actually. And I think in terms, and I call myself, I say a Lovecraftian writer simply because I'm so steeped in the Cthulhu mythos that it seemed, or however you pronounce it, I'm still not sure you actually say Cthulhu, but anyway, it seemed a shame not to make use of it, to be honest. And I always wanted to have that British take on. Well, I'm not the first person to do that. I know there's been other British writers who contributed to Cthulhu mythos. So whilst I call myself a Lovecraftian writer in that sense, and that means the basic point, I think the jumping off point is cosmic horror. Then I hope I can move beyond just being about cosmic horror. Cosmic horror, I would say, is absolutely right on one end of your spectrum, which is affirmative. It is okay. And you look at the original sort of stuff that people were sort of producing. Obviously Lovecraft, but Derleth and people like that. It was a case of there is something. You scratch the surface. There's something beneath it. It's horrible. It's the other. I think I'll fate at this point and say it's indescribable, which tends to happen quite a lot.
Yes, it does.
So I would say because it's rooted in cosmic horror, it's rooted in affirmative horror. Personally, I like both. Certainly, my short form horror has much more disaffirmative in it. Quite explicitly, there's one in which there's. I don't want to say it because it's obviously the whole point of it is it's a great way to have a twist at the end of a story. So I don't want to talk about which story it's in, but some of the stories, it's very obvious where I'm coming from in terms of it being disaffirmative. And yes, we are actually the problem. And if there is a universe out there, God help it when we get there. So I do see myself as actually liking both types. I am hoping during the course of the Glennison series that the disaffirmative will be woven into it. And I've been looking around for it, but half my short story collection is near Carcassonne in France at the moment, so I've not been able to find it. It was a take on a take on a Lovecraftian tale, which I think I can't remember her name. It was a female horror writer, and basically it uses the time of the occupation of the occupation of Congo by Belgium.
Oh wow!
Which was the inspirational Heart of Darkness, which was the and if you look into the history of it, it was whatever other the empires did, and Belgium always looked such a nice country. What happened to Belgian Congo was absolutely a level beyond that. And this particular story had the people who were sort of imposing that sort of regime on the indigenous peoples, being the people who stamped out a Lovecraftian horror in the most brutal way possible. And on the end of it, they're sort of looking, they're sitting around the campfire, literally butchering the remains of and they say, "Hey, we're the good guys." And I thought that was a really good way of actually taking that sort of Lovecraftian affirmative start and actually sort of saying, "But you know what? You can actually make that quite disaffirmative too." And I could see that's the way that I'd like my series to progress. It won't go to Belgian Congo because there's no spoilers there. But I would like it to, and I think the more I've written it, the more I've realized it's actually an awful lot of it is about identity and about anxieties about who we are, who we're actually talking to. When we're talking to someone, are we actually talking to who we think we're talking to? And can we trust a word they say, which I think is very, very much where we are as a society at the moment, certainly in the West. And I think that then allows you to then unplug that route into a disaffirmative approach to it.
And I think, like you said, we as the product of being on the other side of multiple world wars, of the Cold War, of a global pandemic, I don't know if it's that Lovecraft was just so comfortable in who he was which seems to be the case based on some of like the bad things that he was as a person, like that he just didn't occur to him, as a pretty privileged individual, that like the world might not be great for everyone else. But I think it's an impossible place for us to sit in today. And so I think that just having talked to you, that it will become unavoidable for you to start saying, yeah, maybe there is two things, this unspeakable monster out there, but also us. And I like seeing when writers do that. If you find the name of the author for that story, will you send it to me?
I will, because it's a very effective story.
Perfect.
It's very effective. And I think it's, I think you can actually sort of allow that both to exist in the same story, because there may be something bad out there, but generally someone's let it in. And they may have let it in for their own purposes and not done it accidentally. And that then says, well, actually, who's at fault here? Is it that thing that's just being what that thing does? Or is it those amongst us who are seeking to benefit from it?
And there's an American book called Lovecraft Country. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it. It was adapted into a HBO series that actually is even better in some ways, I think. But, the premise is, what if we had a bunch of wizards? Wouldn't that be awful? And then they're like, but also let's remember that in the United States of America, we had racism, which was real and even more awful. And so it kind of was looking at, like in what we call Jim Crow era. So after our civil rights movement, right? Like what would happen if we had African-American characters who were confronting both the supernatural of Lovecraft and the not supernatural awfulness of, America. And I think it's so interesting, right, to be reminded that we can be confronted, like you said, by both the outsider and the insider, and that's somehow even worse, right?
I think so. Yeah. And that's very much what I hope will. I'm hoping that by the end of the series, people sort of realize I've been trying to make some points. I don't want to ram it down people's throats. I want people to come to that awareness themselves. But and I'm hoping, and if you're making points about how things are and how things maybe shouldn't be, I think you are straying into that disaffirmative area. I think you have to be.
Right. And I would imagine that having a series helps with that, right? With the not feeling the urge to cram it down people's throats, because you have the ability to sort of drop it in along the way and not feel like you have to make every statement possible in this one 250, 300 page book.
Yeah.
But I also imagine that writing a series is very hard. So
I suppose you've got to sort of look at you've got to look at the storyline for a novel, and then you've got to look at how that contributes to an arc of the overall arc, and make sure it's consistent, and make sure it's taking people in the right direction, and making sure actually I've got to be putting clues right at the start there, which are going to lead to something that's not going to be finished for a good few years yet. So yeah, it's hard. I've got lots of spreadsheets, and I've got to try and remember, and it's there's all the mundane things like making sure people's eye color and hair color doesn't change. But also, I've got to make sure that if I put that clue there in halfway through novel 1, then by the time it gets to novel N, that has got to still be, that clue has got to be has got to come into play. I do hate loose ends.
Yes. I would love to be there if you could go back in time and tell I don't think I can ever get past 30,000 words, that not only were you going to be writing a novel, but you were going to be writing a series, and that you would be able to have that's continuing power. So, because it's amazing, like that you're, seeding it that carefully, especially considering you at one point didn't know if you could do it. Which I think makes sense when I think about the genres that are at play. The more that you're working at the intersections of these different genres, I feel like the more freedom you have to be creating these really robust worlds without it feeling like fillers. So although you describe yourself, and I understand, like you said, it's an easy way to describe yourself so people know exactly what you're doing as an author of Lovecraftian writing, you could have easily said, I'm an author of Lovecraftian fiction and right, because there's film noir in there. There's elements of modern horror. So you talked about the fact that, the short stories like about the Golden Pyramid feel very modern in terms of accessibility. And I felt that way with yours too, right? Like it doesn't feel like you're trying to mimic a style and a world that no longer exists, right? You're taking that, but making it relevant for today.
Yes. Yeah. I didn't want it to just be pastiche. I mean, there's no point. It's been done.
No, it just would have felt weird, right? Like it wouldn't have felt authentic. So how do you do all of that? How are you taking all of these different genres and what is it about blending them together and creating these texts that are at these intersections, generically speaking, of science fiction, cosmic horror, film noir, modern horror? Like, what is it that makes you excited about that?
I mean, a lot of it sounds like I've sat down and planned it. I really haven't. It's kind of worked out that way.
Okay.
I think once I decided that Derbyshire was not the font of all evil and had to create somewhere, so it was going to be Darkisle. And then I think the way you need to have, I think, a literal journey that people can take with somebody to get to Darkisle. It's a remote place. Why would you be there? So that's where actually the outsider going in is, and then the outsider going in becomes our eyes and our route into Darkisle, which is why I wanted it to be. I think it made sense. It was an investigator. I think it's a good route into it's I mean, it's not very original because we've known a lot, but it's a very good route to get into a community which we say, okay, there's a really strange community here. Let's learn about it together, and it can be going to Twin Peaks, sending an FBI agent to Twin Peaks, it can be sending a policeman to Summit Isle in the Wicker Man. That's quite a good route in, I think, and if that person is then our eyes and ears, they kind of have to be quite an everyman sort of person. They kind of need to be someone that you actually identify with, which I hope Jack is. And then he's got some, whilst he's got some dark backstory, which will be teased out gradually over time. Otherwise, it all becomes tremendously convenient that he's there. If there's not a reason, if there's not something going on in the background. But basically, he's quite a rational person. He's a methodical person. He makes a living from being methodical. So I think that then gave me. And once you've done that, then once you've got that sort of character, and in the 1920s, you're kind of in that noir area, almost without even trying.
Right.
And I feel much more akin to those sort of American type of detective stories from the 20s and 30s than to something like Agatha Christie. I mean, it is a mansion with a cast of characters, and people do say it's quite Agatha Christie-ish in that sense. But I hope it's a little bit grittier in the sense that the protagonists, are not averse to waving guns around if they have to.
Yes.
So I do quite like that sort of. Someone said it was one review I had was a mix of Dashiell Hammett with Agatha Christie. So I'll take that.
I was going to say that sounds like a wonderful thing for someone to say about your writing. It's like, I'll take household names being mixed together.
Yeah,
That's
I'll take
amazing.
that. I'll take that. Yeah,
and I like the fact that, you know, because film noirs can be very dated, because it's always like, you know, here's the dame, and that's all you're going to know, because you don't really need to know her as a female character, because, you know. But I like the fact that you're constantly finding ways to present us with a familiar trope, even if it's, you know, the investigator coming in. But I think a lot of it is Jack, that it also feels, again, it feels like it makes sense for today's audience. If it's characters are developed, like when you present a trope, you also like make it clear why you're still going to use this, even though it's a trope. And that's, I would imagine that's hard to do, but as a reader, I very much appreciate that like nod, but without, like you said, it being pastiche or something that's just, you know, you taking a formula, changing the character's name to Jack Glennison and then calling it good to go. Was there any like intentionality in trying to, were there things you wanted to update from cosmic horror or from film noir, or did it just sort of happen as a byproduct of, you know, living in today?
I don't want to sound all virtue sounding, but I really wanted a strong female character in there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, more than one, but particularly with Josine. It's a nod. I think I also wanted a nod to that sort of the American antecedents of it, and actually sort of, so Josine does give a link to Miskatonic University,
Yes.
which is great. But I also think I wanted someone who was going to be a little less bothered about social norms, which would have still been quite stultifying in Britain in the 1920s. And to actually have someone come in from outside who's not British and is not going to stand on ceremony quite so much, I think is I found very useful. And I found Josine would be quite useful to actually drive the action along a bit, where I was thinking that Jack probably wouldn't do this right now, and Jack probably would take a step back and say, "Oh, hang on, I'm not a serving policeman. I can't do that." And Josie said, "Yes, you can."
So I wish I could be like, "That's not how Americans are," but yes, that is how every American I know is, right? So that makes perfect sense that you would sort of give that to the American, and I like the fact it's also the woman, right? That's just nice to see. She's this is not going to be a surprise. She's not going to be in every book, but she's going to be important to the series. And I think the direction I'm going to take it is, I didn't even realize it was about identity at the start, but as I was writing through it, it is an awful lot of Lovecraft. It is about identity, and it is about creatures that can pass themselves off as human. Yes.
And you can just play that and say, oh, hang on, he took a mask off and it wasn't human. There's a horrible thing behind it, which is fine, but I think you can go deeper than that and sort of actually start to question sort of, well, what, and this is quite a science fiction thing, is at what point is a human not a human anymore?
Right.
Or at what point is a thing that's interpreted with a thing that wants to become human? At what point does it become human?
Yes.
They're sort of interesting questions you can then start asking, I think.
And very relevant to today questions, right? I think about, I don't know if you saw the film Ex Machina, but I think that's, it's not the Turing test. It's one of I think the best films to have that conversation. But here in higher ed, we're talking an awful lot about ChatGPT, right? The software that will write stuff for you. And, the philosophers are like, when does it still count as an authentic, meaningful conversation? And then I'm like, I don't think I have the strength to handle this on a casual Wednesday. So I usually sort of end the conversation at that point. But I think that what's so exciting about your stories is that every one of the questions are questions we're wrestling with even more today, perhaps, than we were when Lovecraft was first writing.
I think so. And I think ChatGPT is an example. I think it's basically the growth of the cyber world that probably instigated that. It's quite glib to say, well, who are you chatting with? It could be anybody. That's quite a straightforward thing. But then you've got what's people's intent, and you've got the way that what 20 years ago would have seemed a great idea. Hey, let's all talk to each other and share ideas, and everyone will know all the facts in the world. Wouldn't that be brilliant?
Yes.
And look how it's turned out. You're thinking, oh, okay, well,
I know. so many of the like, let's connect. What could possibly be wrong about being able to connect
Yes.
with people from around the world? And it's like, studies show connecting with people from around the world leads to depression. And you're like, okay, that's the answer to the question of what could go wrong. So that's exciting that you're going to explore a lot of that. So the next question, and this could be science fiction or fantasy or anything. It doesn't have to just be horror. It could even be nonfiction. But I always like to know, like, what are you engaging with, reading, watching, playing, if you play games right now that you just are really enjoying that you want to recommend to others?
Yeah. I'm actually deep in the throes of my fourth novel. It tends to kill my reading quite
that
a
would
bit,
do it.
actually.
That would do
it.
What
I most recently I found at a little secondhand bookshop, which is still where I like to pick up stuff. An anthology called Dark Visions.
Okay.
And because I feel a fraud on the I'm always trying to catch up. And it's got some big names in there. It's Stephen King. Combination of short stories by Stephen King and Dan Simmons, so I wouldn't really call a horror writer normally. And then there's a novella by George R. R. Martin.
Okay.
So I've been reading that. Kind of mixed response to it, to be honest. I don't think they're King's finest. I quite like the Dan Simmons stuff. Like I said, I wasn't familiar with him as a horror writer. I read his Phases of Gravity, which is a fantastic novel. Which is
okay.
It's about an astronaut, but it's not science fiction at all. It's non-genre, but it's a brilliant novel, very very contemplative novel, I would say. And I've just got to the stage of my bookmark is poised at the start of the George R. R. Martin novella, so I haven't read that yet. So I'm reading that. In terms of as a collection, as an anthology, unless George R. R. Martin pulls it out of the bag, I'm not particularly recommending it.
Okay.
There's a little bit too much whimsy in it. I don't really like whimsy in my horror. And some good body horror, but it's okay. Three. Unless, like I say, I'll wait till I get to the end. But currently, it's looking at like 3 stars from me at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, that's always the challenge, right? When you have like some sort of collection, because just when you get in the like mood of one style of writing, it changes, and I'm not always wanting that, right? I'm not always excited for change, period. But certainly, after 15 minutes, so I could see that being the case. Is there something that's on your shelf that you're looking forward to doing once you're in a pause point for book 4?
It's not particularly horror, but I'm rationing myself with Ian Banks novels, trying to make them last, because there's not going to be any more. So I had a great good fortune to meet him once.
That's amazing.
I'm lucky. I've met 2 of my literary heroes. I've met Ian Banks, and I've met Richard Adams, who wrote Watership Down. So I was quite.
Oh wow!
Quite lucky.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
I'm I've got the Crow Road on my shelf, which is absolutely not a current. This is stuff going back to the 80s, 90s. But I've devoured his science fiction as Ian M. Banks writing, so I've got none of that left. So now I'm working through his non-genre stuff, which is pretty genre quite often anyway. Actually,
yes.
The Bridge is just the way he veers into fantasy. Is and Walking on Glass is another example of that. So yes, wonderful author, and he seemed like a great person, and taken away from us far too soon. So I'm trying to make his novels last. Crow Road up next.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, I was reading a couple of years ago a book, and finished it and was like, okay, when will the next book in the series happen? Because it feels like a finish. And then I read the afterword, and the author was like, I have cancer, and this is probably my last book, and it gutted me, on every level possible. But it's so sad when you know that there's nothing more forthcoming. And do you watch many movies or shows or anything like that? Or are you primarily a reader?
These days, I mean, there was a stage where I'd probably seen every horror and science fiction film up to about the 70s that was made up till about 1970 old-ish, and then I just seem to have had less and less time my last experience, the last horror film. Also, my rest of my family aren't really into it, so it's a case of
that's hard.
Am I gonna go there and sit there by myself, or not? So probably the last outright horror film I saw was Hereditary.
Oh yeah, that's definitely a really impactful film. I struggle with that film because I feel like the last 15 minutes
yeah,
didn't work for me. But until then,
yeah,
it was one of the most incredible films until it derailed.
Yeah, the build up,
Yes,
the build up, and just the feeling of dread.
Yes,
was just
and the
wonderful.
acting was amazing. Yeah,
and then they do what I was like, really?
I know. Someone once described it to me as he didn't show his work, right? So he somehow got from 2 + 2 = 10, and then didn't show how he got to that number 10, and that's where I lost him.
What came to my mind was it's like you started off with Shirley Jackson, you finished off with a chapter of Dennis Wheatley, which
yes, that's a very accurate description. And I know that there were some I've read that there were some studio issues of, they were like, we want more X, and you can almost hear him just being like, okay, you want more of that. It is not the film I'm making, but here it is. But I think that's a perfect example that it's like, if you didn't realize that your book was stuck together and you're suddenly in another story, and then you're like, this doesn't make any sense. But yeah, one of my favorite things to watch, because it excites me, and it's British, so I can mention it to you, and you may or may not know it, is Inside Number 9. I don't know if you watch it.
Yes. I dip into those over the years.
Yes, but
such inventive,
oh my gosh,
diabolicness.
yes, and every one of their horror episodes is remarkably good, considering that it is, I think, very hard to do a whole new horror conceit in a 45-minute, 50-minute, period.
Yeah,
but gosh, and they do make it good,
and they find a way to make humor work in it as well. Quite often.
Oh yes,
quite often, which is brilliant. It's interesting actually. So I think I forget who it was exactly who's the leading light in Inside Number 9, but they worked on League of Gentlemen. If you've ever seen League of Gentlemen, and one of the reasons I decided not to go down the route of having a very intimate horror set in Derbyshire is that League of Gentlemen is set in Royston Vase is actually New Mills, which is in the Peak District in Derbyshire.
Okay.
So I was like, okay, well, someone's already made a horrific Derbyshire village.
That's so funny.
So that's what, because of the League of Gentlemen, that's another reason for me giving up on Derbyshire as a location, saying let's start again.
Which is so funny because I'm sure that means so much to you, but for me, I'm directionally and geographically challenged, period. But certainly I'm like, I don't know, isn't it kind of all the same in England? And I know that's not true, but that's funny that was another like, nope, I guess I have to just invent my own world. But that's lovely.
Yes. Yeah.
And again, look at what we got out of it, right? So I'm rather glad. I feel like I owe them a letter of thank you for not letting you write in the world that we know. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm so done with Derbyshire now. Yeah. So
that's right. I mean, so you just flee for months at a time, which sounds so wonderful. I'm so happy for you. Okay, we've been alluding to it all along, but I think now is the like, give us the names of anything you can give us the names of, and that's the like, what's next from Mark and Drake. So what are you working on or excited about that you can talk about? Because I realize not everything is at a stage you can talk about, but also maybe is there like, do you want to say the name of your books again? Any of that is now, we're now at that point. Yes.
I'll do that. Actually, when you said there's any text that people should read, yes, you should read anything I write, obviously.
Right.
First, the kickoff point for my the series we've been talking about is The Gathering of Shadows.
Yes.
Which, when I named it, I didn't realize there's a Gathering of Shadows, which has got far more likes and reviews. But anyway, it's The Gathering of Shadows, and that's the starting point of the Jack Glennison stories. Currently, there are two that take the action up to the very end of 1922. So that's those Under the Hill and What Festers Within. My most recent one, I'm still doing a little bit of promotional work for, is the short story collection I mentioned, which is Shards of Shattered Darkness. That just came out in January, so I'm still trying to encourage people to read that. And what I'm working on now, so I've some of those were historical short stories that I dug out from years ago. Some of them I wrote for the collection, but either way, I'm trying to shake that short story mentality again and get into the back to long form fiction. So I'm just plotting the details of the fourth novel. As yet, called Book 4.
Yes.
Which takes Jack a little bit further north, a little bit further east on the island. So
excellent. Excellent. And I love the titles of your books. They feel rich. They just, and they both call back, to the Lovecraftian, At the Mountains of Madness, right? You're like, ooh, tell me more. But also just your word choices feel luxurious, which is how all titles should be, right?
Oh, that's very, yeah. I do agonize. I apart from Those Under the Hill, and I was writing that, and that was a description that came, and all the one characters said, "Oh, Those Under the Hill." Oh, let me just Google that. Oh, no one's used it. Right.
Yes.
That one came easily. The other two, I had to think about quite a lot at the end.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm glad. So I'm glad you like them.
Do you think you'll go back to, like, I know some authors who sort of alternate between a long form and a collection of short stories. Are you thinking, like, is that something you want to keep doing? I'm sure you have other short stories you could sort of dust off, or have you found the transition back to long form like too difficult to do this as a regular sort of palate cleanser?
Yeah, I'm erring towards the latter, actually. Yeah. I think it is I find it a very different way of writing. A very different way of writing, and I would say that an 80,000 word novel is more than 10 times as hard as an 8,000 words long short story.
Yes,
there was just more to keep track of. There was more. You've got to work harder, I think. You've got to. I love dialogue. I like dialogue, and sometimes I sort of say, okay, enough talking. Let's. We need to have some. We need to have something that actually informs the reader of what he's actually seeing rather than what he's hearing. Yes. And you've got to think about those sorts of things. You've got those, and the balance between dialogue and description, etc., isn't something that really crops up in a short story. Because either it's bang, you tell a story as you describe something,
right,
or you describe a conversation, and there's no one's too upset if there's a balance of one or the other, because it's only like a 4,000, 5,000 word experience. You've got to really. I find I constantly self-edit as I go through a story. So by the time I get to the end of a story, I've rewritten the first chapter probably certainly about a dozen times, and then the second chapter probably about 11 times. And so as I go through, I'm revisiting it. So it is harder work. Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I feel like there's so many writers that are like, it just depends on what I feel like when I sit down in it. But to me, it's like you said, it's exponentially. It's not just more words, right? It's exponentially. Everything is compounded, and it's, like increased gravity. So by the end, you're like, it's the weight of everything that came before it, not just word 80,000. So it makes me so happy to hear you say that, because I thought it was just me and that everyone else just had no problem switching between forms.
Yeah, so, no, I did have problems, and I enjoyed doing the short story writing. I know a lot of people find it a more accessible way into your writing, so that's one reason to do it. But yeah, I really need to kick that into touch for a while if I'm going to get back to novels. Yeah,
that makes sense. I also hope that at some point you will no longer feel like an imposter, because you most certainly aren't. And not only has this been just a delightful conversation, but your writing is excellent. Your knowledge of, none of us can know everything. I have to tell myself on a regular basis, particularly when I'm in the library and I'm surrounded by books that I will never have a chance to read. I have to be like, no, that's how life is. But this has been so lovely. And it's so exciting to see how everything that reads is thoughtful and intentional truly is, because that's where the magic, I think, of your books come in. And that's why people should read it. So for those of you who are looking for something new to read, you can go to wherever it is that you purchase your books, probably our overlord Amazon, but it could be somewhere else, and you can get a hold of
Barnes and Noble do it, I'm told. So yes.
Good. Yes. So for those of you that want to change it up a little, but thank you so much, Mark. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to keep reading in the world. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Mark N. Drake is a British author of Lovecraftian fiction, though he has been known to write for other genres as well. Most of his works feature his fictional creation Darkisle, a British island of dark secrets and whispered terrors. His first novel, The Gathering of Shadows, was published in 2020. It was the first in a series of Cthulhu Mythos-inspired novels centered upon the cases of private detective Jack Glennison. Based in the northern England of the 1920s, the stories follow Glennison as he explores Darkisle and gradually learns of the ancient horrors that stalk that island and beyond. The follow-up novel, Those Under the Hill, was published in 2021, with What Festers Within following in 2022. More in the series are planned. In 2023, Shards of Shattered Darkness, a collection of 18 of his horror short stories, was released. Despite a misspent youth spent seeking out Panther horror paperbacks in secondhand bookshops, Mark graduated in applied physics and became a defense research scientist. Later, he went on to work in higher education management and to return to education, obtaining an MBA. Now, semi-retired, he divides his time between rural County Durham and Carcassonne in southern France.